Okay, welcome. Last week we were in the two original cities of the Lycus Valley, Colassa and Laodicea. Colassa, the smaller one, Laodicea, the larger one. This week we're going to visit the final one of the three, that is Hierapolis, another very, very historic, interesting, and very visually beautiful location today in present-day Turkey. So we are going to pull up those slides for you, and we'll be off to that very visual location in modern Turkey. So, okay, we remember that in Acts chapter 19, Paul was in Ephesus for quite a long time, a couple of years, and that Acts actually says in Acts chapter 19, verse 10, that during Paul's time there, all Asia heard the word of the Lord. And so during those years that Paul was in Ephesus, some folks came from the area, like uh, Philemon from Colossae to Ephesus, and then came back home and started a house church. Epaphras, who was also from this area, came back and started some churches. So that's about 100 miles. And so a very strong relationship there between uh, those three little towns in the Lycus Valley, actually three bustling cities in the Lycus Valley, in Paul's ministry in Ephesus. Okay, so last week we were at Laodicea looking at the travertine terraces of Hierapolis. That's about 4 or 5 miles away from Laodicea. The city is up on top of the terrace, but the terraces themselves are very beautiful, and that's where we are headed. Hot mineral springs up on top with a lot of minerals, particularly calcium, spilling over the edge and creating this beautiful travertine terrace called in Turkish Pamukkale, which means something like cotton castle. This slide taken during a fairly dry season, and the next one on a nice bright sunny day when the water levels were a little higher. And you can see why this is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The only thing that comes even close to it is Minerva Terraces in Yellowstone, which are also very lovely, but not even close to the scale of these travertine terraces here at Hierapolis. We're going to go now up on top, up above those travertine terraces to where the city itself actually was. City being over there, we're now kind of in the travertine terraces, looking at a side view. You can begin to see where the little pools form, and then the water flows down. The calcium is left behind and creates this excellent, kind of a like a beautiful marble waterfall of solid stone. It's just beautiful. Okay, here we are in the city itself. We're walking into the city of ancient Hierapolis, which flourished from about 200 or 300 BC until about 600 or 700 AD. As we walk in, we're walking through the cemetery, the necropolis, or city of the dead, with tombs, and more tombs. Approximately 1,200 tombs that have been discovered along this mile-long road into the city. Um, Hierapolis was a uh, healing place. Probably the closest comparison is Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Some of you will know your Arkansas history that when Dr. Alva Jackson came to Eureka Springs in 1856, he said, this water healed my eye diseases. And then another friend of his came and was healed of rheumatism. And so throughout the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, Eureka Springs, the whole country was flocking to Eureka Springs to get healed. That's what was happening here in Hierapolis um, about the time of the Apostle John and before and somewhat after. Uh, earlier tumulus style tombs, um, early tumulus style tombs, later sarcophagus, which is like a big stone coffin, sarcophagus, individual person inside there. Also mausoleums which could house the remains of a whole family. Just literally thousands of people buried here. Um, Many of the coins that have been discovered in the excavation here at Hierapolis, Italians doing a wonderful job here. Many of the coins have on them in little images of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, and Hygeia, his daughter. So people would have been coming here to get healed um, and carrying those coins with them. Uh, the fact that there's such a massive, massive cemetery might tell you whether all of those people were healed and got back safely back home. Um, it's kind of the necropolis is kind of a testimony against the healing power of the pool. Although you can understand that if someone were suffering from rheumatism or something like that, uh, perhaps a good soak in the warm mineral springs would bring terrific relief, at least for a time, and then the word gets out, and so the place prospers. This particular tomb is a tomb of a Jewish family going back to 2 or 300 BC. Many Jewish families settled throughout Western Asia Minor. There's a menorah carved right there. With this, it's kind of a little hard to see, but it's right there. Also a shofar and a lulav. And this is so then marked as a Jewish tomb. Several Jewish tombs here in Hierapolis. We're going to go inside here in a moment. You'll see the bench, and those of you who have delved into burial customs in the first century AD around Jerusalem will recognize what happens is the deceased is laid on the bench 1 year later. The family comes back, collects the bones, puts them in a bone box or ossuary, and that's tucked underneath here, and then you are sleeping with your ancestors. So that was how that worked. The main road now, as we're getting closer to the city, this is the main road with the main gate of the entrance to the city. Again, just gives you a sense of how large and impressive these cities were. Um, Philip the Apostle would have come here about the same time that Matthew went to Antioch to give some apostolic anchoring to the church in Antioch, and the Apostle John went to Ephesus to give some apostolic anchoring to Ephesus. Probably about that time, Philip the Apostle would have come here to Hierapolis. All of this would be the late 60s. So by this time, Peter and Paul are both gone. And I suspect these other apostles felt a need to get up here, give some apostolic anchoring, because Western Asia Minor was really, really the power center of Christianity in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s AD. Um, the theater, classic Greco-Roman theater in Hierapolis with our Turkish tour guide. And the main part of the city here, and those beautiful travertine terraces as you fall off the cliff over here. As I mentioned, the Italians are doing a great job excavating here at Hierapolis. Many of these theaters were built in the hillside with some lovely view in the background. It's kind of ironic, though, because um, today we sit in those and we say, "Oh, what a great view out of the countryside." But actually, if you were in the theater at the time that they were built, especially if you were in the theater proper here, not the overflow seats, if you were in the theater proper, you didn't see that. You saw the Scene, the backdrop, which is the origins of our word scene, English word scene. This is one of the few theaters where the Scene has survived to such a wonderful extent. And the idea being, of course, that if you're in the theater, you're supposed to be paying attention to the drama on the stage and the scene or the Scene behind it, which reinforces the drama. You're not supposed to be looking at the countryside. And this is one of the few theaters where you can understand that because the Scene has survived to such an extent. So the large theater, not as large as the theater in Ephesus. We think that great theater in Ephesus is around 24,000. This is more like 15 to 20,000, depending, of course, on how tightly you sit, but you can see a very significant theater. Okay. Um, As I mentioned, a classic Greco-Roman city. Ephesus, around the time of the Apostle Paul, 50s and 60s, would have brought Christianity here. By the time we get down to the 60s or 70s, Philip the Apostle has moved here. Now, you need to be careful to distinguish Philip the Apostle from Philip the Deacon. Philip the Deacon, one of the seven, who is not actually called a deacon, but we tend to refer to them as deacons. That would be Acts chapter 6. Philip the deacon, let's say, he's one of those seven who is chosen to help oversee the charitable distribution. He pops up again in Acts chapter 8. He's in Samaria. And then a little bit later in Acts chapter 8, he's on his way to Gaza, to the road down to Egypt. He confers with the Ethiopian official, more properly Sudanese official. That's Acts chapter 8. Then he moves to Caesarea on the coast, Caesarea Maritima on the coast, and he's still there at Acts chapter 21, verse 8. So that's Philip the deacon. Apparently spent his whole career in Palestine. In contrast, Philip the apostle, who was one of the 12 apostles, is the one that we are quite sure came here to Hierapolis. Um, Nice little confirmation of the fact that that was in fact Philip the apostle here is the fact that when the apostle John writes his gospel in Ephesus, remember close by, he mentions Philip several times. John chapter 1, John chapter 6, John chapter 12, and John chapter 14. Um, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not mention Philip the apostle that frequently. John, the gospel writer, does because Philip the apostle lived in this area. So John's audience, which is Ephesus and surrounding, would have known him personally. And so he makes a point. Okay, so then he's ministering here for some time. Then about 80 AD, Philip dies as a martyr here in Hierapolis. And this then later, after Christianity becomes the dominant religion, some of the Jesus followers build some monuments here on the hillside to remember Philip. Marturion, uh, on the spot where Philip was martyred, and then later a church where we could gather for worship. And this would have been built around 400 something AD. And then so with a nice stairway where in the 400s and 500s, Christian pilgrims from all around the world could come to this spot to remember the ministry and the martyrdom of Philip. We're going to go up those stairs right there. It's kind of off on the edge of the modern ruins of Hierapolis. That's the stairway right there. I know I should have taken this when the people were coming up, not down, but that is the stairway. And then as you get to the top, it's not quite as steep, so it's just a path. And then you arrive at the actual location where Philip sealed his testimony with his life around 80 AD. And then Christians a few years later, actually a couple centuries later, built this martyrion to remember him. Then about 40 yards away, they built that church. And for many years, the archaeologists were looking for the tomb of Philip here by the martyrion, the spot where he died. In 2011, they realized it wasn't here. The tomb was actually over as part of the church, about 40 yards away. And that is now Philip's, understood to be the tomb of Philip the Apostle, and discovered in 2011. The bones were not there. They probably would have been transferred to Constantinople or Rome, but the archaeologists are sure this is where Philip the Apostle was buried. We happen to have Philip the Traveler with us, and so we put Philip the Traveler in front of Philip the Apostle's tomb just to make a little connection for you. Still a very honored name in Christian circles. Originally a Greek name, of course, father of Alexander, but also became common in Christian circles because of Philip the Deacon and Philip the Apostle. Okay, coming back down off the hill of the Marturion toward the Travertine Terraces. Again, these little altars or kind of a somber reminder. During the first century here in Western Asia Minor, there'd be a civic obligation. There would be a small fire burning, and the citizens would all walk past, throw a little pinch of incense on the fire, and say, Caesar is Lord. Caesar is Lord. And that was showing your loyalty to Caesar, your loyalty to you doing your civic duty, keeping the Roman gods pleased with the city, and so forth. And followers of Jesus, of course, tended not to do that, and which is what got them in trouble. And when you read Revelation chapter, well, all of the book of Revelation, that's what the conflict, because the followers of Jesus were very convinced on good grounds that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. And so this was the heart of the conflict. Very close by the pool where in ancient days the bubbling springs, warm mineral springs, and you could swim in the pool and get some relief. So, okay, beautiful view off toward Colassa in the springtime. And couldn't resist one more shot of those beautiful travertine terraces. So there it is, right there. Okay, well, thank you for joining us. Hope you learned some new things. Well, we're hoping next week to go to Bethlehem and do some things that would get us ready to celebrate Christmas, the birth of the Savior in Bethlehem. So, okay, well, thanks for joining us and hope to see you next week.